A loud gasp erupted as air filled Twilight's lungs once more. She coughed and sputtered as she quickly regained consciousness, gasping and sputtering as she struggled to fill her lungs with air. She sat up, placing a hoof against her mouth as she tried to control her violent coughing fit. It felt as though fire were burning in her lungs, and her coughing was the only thing that could put out the flames. It took several minutes before her coughing died down and turned into heavy, panting breaths, as the world finally took a moment to stop spinning around her. Her eyes were squeezed shut as she took in several deep breaths of air, feeling as though she had just been to the point of drowning and was returning to the world anew. Her eyes slowly flickered open from her coughing fit, moisture blurring her vision. The world came in as dimly lit, murky colors that melted together in her vision. She rubbed her eyes quickly with her hoof, trying to bring the world back. She blinked a few times, clearing the last bit of blur from her eyes and looking around again. The familiar sight of Fluttershy's living room came into her view. The deathly quiet house was the exact same condition as when she had left it, dusty, broken, and in a shambled mess. I'm alive. Twilight spoke aloud, placing her hoof against her cheek, as if trying to confirm what had just happened. Her hoof moved to feel her body. None of the burns she had suffered from the malformed were there. It was as if the acid had never touched her body. She even pressed her hoof against her shoulder. The broken alicorn had ran her sword through, and found it somehow felt okay. A thought instantly burst into her mind, and her hoof raised up to see if her horn had somehow returned to itself. It was there, sticking out of her forehead the same as it always had. Her hoof brushed against the length of it, looking for any signs of damage or blood or surgery, but it was as if nothing had happened at all. The shock washed over Twilight for a moment, as her hoof gently lowered. She just stared at her horn, thinking about what she had just gone through, when something surprising happened. A chuckle escaped her lips. It started off slow, but it quickly became more. She felt her pent-up emotions, her frustration, her anger, her confusion, her despair. It all came out just now. It came out in a twisted, hollowed, demented laugh that seemed to echo through the house. She couldn't believe it. The world was screwing with her. It was literally screwing with her mind and changing everything she'd ever known about the world around her, because it could. It made her laugh. It made that haunting, bellowing chortle escape her lips as she thought about the insanity she had lived through. At least 3 times that day, she had already brushed with death, and each time she had somehow come back just to brush with death again. I get it. Twilight rubbed the hoof against her face as she felt her body shake with the laughter. You're trying to break me. Trying to make me accept death. Finally her laughter began to calm. She raised her hoof to rest against her eye as she started to stare at nothing, just blankly into space. It was as if she were trying to stare at the world around her itself. You haven't broken me yet, world. She closed her eyes, lowering her head to rest her hooves against the ground. You've crossed a line. I hope you realize, she growled. You're messing with my friends. The images of Rainbow Dash and Fluttershy's bodies crawling out of the mirrors flashed in her mind. The images of them calling out for love. You can't screw with me all you want. You can hurt me, torture me, twist the world to play by your rules. Her head rose, staring straight into the empty space before her. But you do not mess with my friends. With the venom dripping from her mouth, she finally pushed herself up under all her hooves. She immediately felt her body shift a little unusually, realizing that she could feel the weight of all the items still stored within her magical inventory. She had access to its contents once more, a fact she was relieved to know. Before she stepped forward, her eyes wandered to the ground before her, where she noticed 2 items that she hadn't seen before. She recognized them. There were the 2 books that she had been carrying around with her, the ones she had taken from the Stalingrad library. Looking at the covers, she noticed something odd. One of the covers had vanished, just like the other book. Of the 2 books, one, with the remaining cover, was Heaven's Food. That meant that the old widow no longer had words to it. Twilight flipped open the cover of the blank book, just to double check. She flipped through a few pages, seeing nothing written upon each one, and then looked at Heaven's Food and opened it once more, seeing a story neatly written inside with the illustrations included. She quickly shut the book, wrapping it in her magic and returning it to her bulky storage. I don't know what this means, she grunted softly, pushing the now blank book aside with her hoof. If it's a clue or something, it's lost on me. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm herself down. She opened her eyes once more and looked around the destroyed room of Fluttershy's house. It was fairly certain at this point that Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash were no longer in this house. In fact, it might not have been at the house at all. She kicked herself mentally for that. If they were half the ponies she knew them to be, they would have left in search of her and the others a long time ago. They weren't the type of ponies to stand around and do nothing while their friends might be in potential danger, especially not Rainbow Dash. It was likely they hadn't been here for a while now. Calm down, Twilight. Just take a moment to think things through. She calmed herself by speaking out loud, something to break the deathly silence that was around her. Your friends would likely go out either searching for you and the others, or to help other ponies, or are out getting lost in the warping, fog-ridden mazes that you've been falling into. Her eyes flickered back and forth, staring at absolutely nothing in particular as she thought about her plan. You don't know which way they would have started heading. You don't have a single clue as to how you'd get in contact with them. This world seems to decide when I can and can't meet ponies. Her thoughts went quiet at those words, as a realization slowly dawned on her. It decides I can meet ponies. Except for one. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even really a lead. But there was one pony that she had met that hadn't been directed by the world saying if she could or couldn't. One pony that seemed to even defy the world she was currently in. One pony that was currently taking care of one of her dearest friends right at the moment. I have to get back to Stalingrad Library, Twilight said, letting the confidence back into her voice. She stepped over the fallen debris of Fluttershy's living room, quickly heading to the door. She grabbed hold of it with her magic and opened it, staring out at the fog-filled world once more. She perked her ears up, listening carefully, listening for any possible sound of the dragon that seemed to be guarding the town. Silence was all that greeted her, with a small smile forming on her face. She didn't feel like she was wasting any more time just standing around. With determination, she broke out into a quick trot, heading straight for the Stalingrad Library. Twilight watched carefully from the edge of a building, spotting the slowly lurching figure in the fog, making its way across the street. She couldn't make out the details of what it looked like, but she had no doubt in her mind that it was the outline of the soldiers that she had seen before. Each time she had encountered them in the streets of Ponyville so far, she had found herself swarmed, surrounded by them, and only able to escape by the skin of her teeth. She wanted to get to Stalingrad Library without incident. Even if she had the sledgehammer to defend herself with, it wasn't going to do much against a whole pack of those soldiers. The shadow was dragging its heavy weapon along the ground as usual. She could hear the scraping of metal on stone, even from this distance. She kept her ears open, her eyes fixated on the shadow moving through the fog. It didn't take very long for the shadow to finally disappear into the depths of the shadows. The scraping of metal was slow to follow, but eventually the town returned to the quiet it had before. Nothing more than the sound of a gentle breeze and the creaking of old buildings. Finally releasing the breath that she had been holding, Twilight stepped out from behind the building. The normal scrape of her hooves was muffled as she walked, each step sinking into the thickening layer of ash that now covered the ground. It continued to fall from the sky, a slow and never-ending pour of soot. Twilight stuck close to the edges of the building, quickly breaking into her trot as she continued towards her destination. It wasn't far now. She knew exactly where it would be. Her ears were perked at all times, trying to listen to the sounds of any creatures that wanted her hide. The dragon had been nowhere to be heard so far. In fact, that surprised her considering how close it had come to Fluttershy's cottage. So far, she'd only encountered the occasional soldiers stumbling around town, all of which she'd carefully managed to maneuver around. For her efforts, she was finally rewarded with a sight of the building that she'd been looking for. With heavy breaths, her eyes fell upon the large words, Stalingrad Library. For once, something in this crazy world had stayed consistent. She gave her blessings to the fact that the buildings had somehow magically not managed to vanish in the short time she'd been gone. But it wasn't just the feeling of something familiar in a world that was constantly changing and screwing with her mind. No, it was another emotion that was welling up inside of her. She wanted to see Spike. She'd left him in the hooves of the only pony in town that seemed even remotely qualified to be able to take care of him right now. A fellow researcher, and a published one at that. He may have seemed a little off-putting, but there still was a possibility that he had somehow started all of this. But he still had the only safe haven in the entire town. She climbed the steps of the Stalingrad Library, wanting to head straight for the back and meet the familiar face, someone who could, let her rest and lean on for at least a moment. But her hooves stopped at the door as a piece of paper came into view. To Miss Twilight Sparkle, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it appears that my initial research wasn't as accurate as I believed. The symbols that I placed to create a barrier against the monsters has a time limit on how long it will work. I need to do some more research into how long it lasts for, but needless to say, Stalingrad Library is no longer safe for me and your companion. I will continue to ensure his safety as we move to our next location, however. You need not worry about that. His well-being is my top priority. So that you may find our new safe haven, I'm leaving a trail of notes for you. So far, the monsters have appeared to be unable to read, so we should be safe leaving them for you. This town will do crazy things to the mind if you let it, Miss Sparkle. Keep yourself strong. Magus V. Dark Arts. At the bottom of the page, a large arrow was pointing to the east. Twilight's heart sank a little upon reading the note, but was relieved to hear that when the safe haven had failed, that the two of them had managed to escape the library unscathed, at least enough to be able to write such an elaborate note. She quickly picked up the note and placed it within her storage, not wanting to lose it at such an important time. Though this did mean that she had to spend more time wandering through the ash-covered town, and the air was thick with the burned remains, and was starting to make breathing more and more difficult. She was also ever fearful of the dragon making a reappearance, as she still had no proper means to defend herself from it. If it were to show up, she'd have to rely on just running away like she had twice before now, a tactic she feared would not be enough to save her again. With a shake of her head to clear her thoughts, she stepped down from the entrance of the Stalingrad Library, and looked in the direction of the note had been pointing. It didn't take long for her eyes to spot a similarly pieced paper on the wall of one of the buildings, near the library, almost hidden by the fog, but just visible enough for her to see it. It was pointing straight ahead, mostly likely to another hidden note within the town. Twilight brought herself to a quick trot once again, heading towards the ashen streets of Ponyville, her eyes wandering for any lumbering soldiers that might attempt to attack her, while also keeping a lookout for new notes. One by one they appeared on the sides of buildings, pointing her further and further towards the outskirts of town. They traveled such a long distance, she thought to herself, realizing how far this actually was from the library. And that's a long time for Spike to be in danger. What was he thinking? Where were they headed? She didn't like the idea that baby dragon had to be exposed to any more of this town than was necessary. It was already taking a heavy toll on her mind as it was. She couldn't even imagine Spike having to go through some of the things she'd already been through. She didn't want him to have to see the things she'd seen. She wanted Spike to be safe. She wanted nothing more than to lift this fog and return Ponyville to the thriving small town it once was. Back to the home she was proud of. Not the blood-coated streets she now walked. Her trotting slowed to a walk, before becoming almost a slow crawl and stopping entirely. She blinked in realization of where the notes had led her. Completely unobstructed by locked doors and any sign of monsters, she found herself standing before the entrance of a familiar grove of trees. She was right in front of Sweet Apple Acres. Did they really escape to Sweet Apple Acres? Her mind asked, looking around at the various trees that she could see, All the leaves had shriveled up and died, yet were still somehow miraculously attached to the limbs of each of them. She couldn't spot any apples, though that was to be expected, as the harvest season had well ended before the start of winter. Twilight had been certain that the apple family had removed all the dead leaves from the trees before winter hit, yet there they were, blackened, shriveled leaves atop each of them. I suppose that would make sense if Spike was with Magus. He was probably the one who had the idea of going here. If Applejack was anywhere, she'd be here trying to protect her family first. She wouldn't just abandon them if she knew they were in danger. The thought gave Twilight some comfort and a bit of hope. The idea that maybe Spike and Magus were meeting up with Applejack and her family, that he'd use his magic to give them a safe haven, and they'd be waiting for her safe and sound within that familiar red barn. She wanted to gasp onto that hope, and Lance's words came to mind once more. So long as she believed this town was winning, it was going to win. Her mind was faltering, she was aware of that. It was straining from how illogical, cruel, and vile this town had become. But she needed something to grasp onto now, something to give her strength to move forward. So she clung to the hope that she'd see them again, and stepped into the forest. The shadow flashed from a corner of her eye, and she immediately swiveled her head in its direction. She stared into the foggy, dense forest of trees, scanning slowly with her eyes, trying to spot where the movement had been. For a moment she thought that her mind was playing tricks on her, but she knew she couldn't let herself fall for such a false sense of security. Not now. She lifted her front legs slowly, continuing to walk deeper into the forest of Sweet Apple Acres, as she slowly removed the sledgehammer from her magic. She held it slowly by her side and strained her ears carefully. The rune that hung from her neck wasn't emitting a strange static it normally did when a creature was close, so that was a sign that told her she was safe. But it didn't mean she'd stay that way. She had heard the sounds of leaves crunching under hooves, and snapped her head in that direction, ready for the sound this time. Her eyes stared intensely at the fog. The nothing that was there stared back at her, almost hauntingly. Was something following her through the woods? She wouldn't be surprised if that were the case. It was exactly the kind of thing she would expect this town to do right now. She gently swung the sledgehammer in the air, and immediately felt the difference in weight distribution was from the swords she was experienced with wielding. There was no way she could be able to adequately fight with such a bulky weapon to her. It would give anything that attacked her a good concussion if she could get a clear shot, but it lacked the finesse that a true weapon should. However, she was not going to give whatever it was following her the idea that she was unable to defend herself at the moment, and she continued slowly through the dead trees. If she remembered correctly, and she was certain she did, it wouldn't take her too long to reach the barn from this end of the woods. The positioning of the trees looked familiar. She'd been through them enough times with Applejack to start calling them a second home from Ponyville. If she followed the trees, she was straight. She'd make it to the barn before the rune began to buzz, letting out that familiar warning she dreaded. Her head frantically snapped back and forth, trying to find the location of the source, before swiveling in time to see a large object coming from behind her. The object struck her body hard, air escaping her lungs as she went hurling through the air. Her back hit the ground first, the shock forcing her to roll through the ash before sliding to a stop. A pained groan escaped Twilight's lips as she managed to stand up, grateful that she had avoided being hurled into any of the trees. She spotted the sledgehammer having landed next to her and quickly wrapped it around her magic, raising it to face whatever creature it was that had launched the attack. Her heart sank as she saw, just a few yards away from her, the pulsing black orb that seemed to bend reality around itself. From its center, the black-skinned pony head began to pull free from the twisted mess of shadows that surrounded it. It let loose the horrific, low-pitched howl from its sewn mouth. The pale, pupilless eyes popped open as two hooves extended and slammed into the ground. Held by chains and shackles that stretched into the darkness. It was the same creature that had separated her from Lance back at the hotel, but Lance was nowhere in sight now. Its pure white eyes seeming to pierce straight through her. Terror shot through her spine. Her body instinctively backing away slowly as her pendant roared its symphony of static. Its growling was a low-pitched howl, as if pulling itself out of its murky, shadowy orb was painful. The shackles rattled, and it cracked its head, looking at her, as if the sides of the black ribbons began to ooze out once more. Twilight glanced at the sledgehammer she was floating in front of her, then back at the creature, watching the ribbons grow larger and longer. Her realization of what she was faced with and what she was fighting with hit her like a sack of bricks. I can't fight this thing with a sledgehammer. The orbed creature let out a loud, piercing roar through its sewn mouth, and the ribbons shot forward. Reality snapped back to her, and Twilight jumped, the ribbons swerving, trying to reach the escaping unicorn, crashing into the various dead trees that surrounded her in the process. She found herself tumbling through the ashes once more, broken twigs and splintered wood flying over her head. The ribbons began to retract as Twilight stood up, the shackled legs of the warped thudding loudly against the ground as it began to turn its body to face her. She didn't let it have the time it needed to refocus its efforts on her, turning and pushing against the ground to escape. She broke out into a frantic run, racing towards the dead woods that made up the apple orchard, her mind screaming at her to get to the barn. The sound of snapping wood and collapsing trees echoed right behind her as the large black ribbons flew inches away from her head. The mass of skin-like cloth struck a pair of particularly large trees in front of her, causing the trees in front of her to crack loudly and begin their downward crashing arc. Twilight's eyes widened as she saw the large trees about to crash down in front of her, directly in her path. She grit her teeth and concentrated her magic, shooting it forth at the trees coming down. They immediately froze in place, suspended by the purple magic as Twilight escaped underneath them. Once past, her magic broke free, and they crashed loudly to the forest floor. The loud roar of the black-orbed monstrosity echoed through the trees, as Twilight's panting grew louder. The buzzing of her medallion began to gradually slow to a dim hum before becoming silent itself. Twilight dared a peek over her shoulder as she continued to run, not seeing the ribbons or the creature itself chasing after her. She didn't dare breathe a sigh of relief, though, not until she knew she was in the clear. She was close to reaching the barn. Now, though, she just had to clear the orchard. The familiar red barn came quickly into view, looking worse for wear, much the same as everything else did, but Twilight was elated to see it nonetheless. The forest line cleared around her, and she finally was in the familiar opening of her friend's home. She wasted no time bolting straight for the door, only slowing down to a walk once she was right at the front steps. She slipped the sledgehammer she'd been carrying the whole time back into her inventory and stared at the door. Plastered on the front of it was a runic blue symbol that Magus had told her about, the one that drove monsters away. Her heart rose to her throat in hope, praying that what was behind the door was exactly what she wanted, the exact reason she had come here for. Her hoof twitched hesitantly as it reached the door. She was nervous now, thinking that she had come this far, gone through this much, and right behind these doors was exactly what she'd been searching for. She thought of all the horrible things that could be behind the door as well. Some new monstrosity that she'd never seen before could have managed to break through the symbol. Or perhaps it was as Lance said, and in fake versions of people she cared about. Her hoof pressed down against the door, and she tried to swallow the lump in her throat that was making it hard to breathe. She turned the knob, finding that it was indeed unlocked, and gently swung the door open, taking a step inside to see what was waiting. The first thing she spotted was a lit fireplace in the living room, and in front of the flickering flames were two figures, one scruffy-looking stallion, and that turned to look at her, and the other, Twilight! A small purple blur got up from where it had been sitting and rushed over, wrapping its arms around the soot-covered unicorn that had walked through the door. Twilight stared down in shock at the baby dragon that hugged her, nestling in affection. "I'm so glad you're okay. I was so worried." His voice shook as he hugged her. The lump in Twilight's throat didn't fade, but instead seemed to grow bigger. She began to tremble as her body collapsed into a sitting position. Her hooves snapped up and wrapped the baby dragon tightly, squeezing him into her chest as tears began to streak down her cheeks. "Spike, it's really you. Oh, thanks Celestia, it's you," she said shakily. a bright smile forming on her face as she pressed her face into his head. The two of them just stood there in their embrace at the doorway, not caring for a moment what the world outside held, some distant abominations or horrors, that she had seen things that she'd wished she'd never had to relive. All that mattered was that she was holding Spike again, closely holding someone she loved so dearly. "I told you I'd take care of him, Miss Sparkle," Magus said, looking at the scene of affection with a chuckle. "I am a stallion of my word." "Thank you, Magus," was all Twilight could manage to get out between the tears streaking down her dirty face. She was just happier than she could believe, happier than she thought she'd be, just to hold Spike again. "Twilight, you're covered in ash," Spike said, lifting his arm to see that it was now covered simply from hugging the unicorn. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. We found some clean water that we can use." He broke the hug first to lead Twilight to where she could clean up. Twilight couldn't help but watch in awe as the little dragon still cared more about her well-being than the horrors that seemed to surround them. It was almost surreal, escaping a white world of death and coming to the one with a loving embrace to it. Her smile returned to her face. She turned and closed the door behind her, letting the moment soak in. "Yeah, let's get me cleaned up,"